Full room, and particularly delighted to welcome you here to the Aura Innovation Centre, the Net Zero Centre for the Humber. And I think we're also joined by quite a few people online, so hopefully the technology will work. I'm particularly excited about this subject today because I worked both on Peterhead and Doncaster on carbon capture some 15 years ago, and it was too soon. But now is the right time, and it's the right people. It's definitely the right place. So I'll introduce the panel to you briefly, and then in more detail as they each get up to speak. So to my left is Chris Barron from the Decarbonised Gas Alliance. They're not in order. Dan Sadler from Equinor, Tongi Cosmao, better.
She's completely fluent in French. So.
I should say it better, Cosmao. And then Jonathan Oxley from the Humber Industrial Cluster. So, Chris, you're first, aren't you? So, would you like to?
Thank you. Right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I think this is the clicker that should get us going. So hopefully one more. There we are. Right. So welcome to day 5 of our Decarbonised Gas Alliance Roadshow. We set off from Westminster with a launch on Monday, travelled to Swindon, Wales, St Helens in the northwest, and captured the HyNet project. And then we had a day off yesterday, which was greatly appreciated. And then here today. And many thanks to Equinor and the Aura Science Innovation Centre for hosting our event today. I always like to start with this slide, which sort of reminds us all of why we are all here today. And this is all about the impacts of climate change and the impact that we as a human race are impacting our planet. So the recent IPCC report highlighted the impacts of climate change that aren't going to happen in 5-10 years somewhere down the track. They're happening now. We're regularly seeing extreme weather events. You know, the top left-hand image is the strongest typhoon Asia has seen in history. The bottom left is the floods in Europe earlier this year, which sadly took over 250 lives and caused devastating damage. But the one that's probably most poignant to me is the one on the right-hand side, which is a refugee camp in Nepal, where villagers that live a very, very, very simple life compared to the way we live our life, and certainly have done nothing to contribute to climate change. The villages were washed away through glacial melt, so people who had very little to start off with have had everything taken away from them through the impacts of climate change. So I think it's always worth just starting on that point and remembering what this is all about. So the Decarbonised Gas Alliance is an organisation that represents the full chain of organisations involved in enabling decarbonised gas as part of the solution, as a component of the solution to achieving net zero. We cover biomethane, hydrogen produced from waste, and decarbonised low-carbon gas from waste. But more importantly, hydrogen and companies involved in hydrogen production, hydrogen transportation, so the gas distribution networks and National Grid are part of our organisation, and end users. Decarbonised gas, especially hydrogen, is seen as playing a critical role in achieving net zero, and it picks up some of the difficult, hard to electrify and decarbonise end uses such as industry, heavy transport, and has huge potential for domestic heat. I'd just like to say, by the way, huge congratulations to the Humber cluster. It's been an exciting week with announcements from government, but the Humber cluster and the HyNet project both being given track 1 status. So we'll see. It clears the blockers to actually see some scalable emissions reductions from these tremendous projects. And I'd also like, if there was any ask I would have, it would be for the government to find a way to also fund the Acorn cluster in Scotland, because we need all of them, and we need all of them quickly and now. Our roadshow. So we came up with this concept of a roadshow of activities, basically touring the country. We set off from Westminster on Monday, called into Swindon, the ABSL plant there, which takes general waste and turns it into biomethane at the moment, but they are moving the plant to produce hydrogen, and we'll be injecting 1% hydrogen into the gas network. And actually produces a negative CO2 impact, so actually something to offset some of the remaining emissions. We then went across to Welsh Water in Wales, where we saw hydrogen, with the plans to produce hydrogen, inject hydrogen into the grid from wastewater treatment. We then travelled up to, what day were we on Friday? So Wednesday we were up in, lose track of days, it's been a hectic week. We then travelled up to St Helens, to Pilkington Glass, where for the first time ever globally, glass was produced using 100% hydrogen. So tremendous project, and showing the potential and opportunity of hydrogen in industry. Day off yesterday, here today, delighted to be here at this exciting project, at this exciting time as well, as I say, with recent government announcements. And next week, we're back on the road again, up to Teesside, up to the DMV test facility, and then up to Aberdeen, where we're running a mini-COP event with local school children. So really exciting time. Big challenge, but really exciting. But the whole purpose of this roadshow is to promote the things that are happening right now, the projects, the initiatives that are happening right now, and will move decarbonised gas, hydrogen from a concept to reality. So great to be here, great to be involved with this project. And the intent is to provide a platform for each of these locations to be able to showcase and socialise all the great work that they're doing, and to socialise that message on a regional basis, to get the opportunity to make people aware of the opportunity that decarbonisation provides in their region. Jobs, job creation, GVA into the local economy. So with that, I will hand over to Dan.
Yes, and I should have introduced you properly, and apologies.
That's okay.
So Chris has 35 years of experience in this area.
I didn't really want you to say that, Louise. Just tell people how old I am.
With Costain, and is now chair of the Decarbonised Gas Alliance. So apologies for that.
That's
so next, Jonathan Oxley, who is the Humber Cluster Plan Manager.
Thank you.
And he's a chemist by training and was with BP for over 20 years, including a secondment to the Energy Technologies Institute and leading national and international projects. He manages the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan, which is very topical, and comprehensive roadmap for decarbonising industry in the region, with the ambition of making us the world's first net zero industrial cluster by 2040.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Louise, and thank you for the invitation to speak. It's been a very exciting week, as you've heard. The fact that the Humber cluster, the Humber Industrial Cluster, is the largest industrial cluster in the UK is probably no surprise to most of you in this room, I suspect. Many of you will know that already. And that's nothing to be ashamed of. The fact that we have so much in the way of CO2 emissions is actually a reflection that we make and produce so many things in this region that other people in the world, elsewhere in the world, and the UK, obviously want to buy. So that's a good thing, actually. But we need to do something about it, quite clearly. However, did you also know that the Humber has about 25% of the UK's gas coming through our kind of landfall, as it were? We also account for something like 25% of the UK's seaborne trade through the Humber estuary. So this is a real industrial powerhouse. We have steel manufacture, we have glass production, we have refining, we have chemicals and petrochemicals, we've got lime production, and if it wasn't important enough that we make the steels at the steel rails at British Steel Scunthorpe's, we also are now starting to increasingly make things like the carriages and the locomotives that might run on them through the Siemens Rail factory at Goole. We've got cement production, we've got caravan manufacture, we've got wind turbine blade productions. This is an incredible industrial powerhouse for the UK. I think that sets the scene very, very nicely. But we are 30% larger in CO2 emissions than the next biggest industrial cluster in the UK. In fact, we're almost so big that we're the same size as the next two biggest industrial clusters added together. That's how big the CO2 emissions are. And if that wasn't enough, when you frame those CO2 emissions against what the UK produces as a whole through all the sectors, we account for about 5% of the UK's CO2 production through our industry in the Humber. Forget transport, very important. Forget agriculture, very important. Forget domestic heating, very important. We're just talking about our industry producing 5% of all the CO2 in the UK. That is a huge, huge percentage to be tackled. And that's why it's so vitally important that we do something about CO2 production from our industry in the Humber. Now, the Humber Industrial Cluster is the only cluster in the UK, and there are 5 other great clusters, fantastic clusters, and we will need all of them, as the previous speaker just said, and probably more too, by the way. But the Humber Industrial Cluster is the only cluster with 2 planned onshore deployment projects. The only one. And we're also, if that wasn't enough, we're the only industrial cluster that has 2 proposed offshore deployment projects. Some of this is a little bit dated because things have moved on with the East Coast cluster. But that gives us options. And it also shows the level of ambition in our region to be able to do something about this, which is fantastic. The Humber Industrial Cluster Plan is about bringing all of that together. The Humber Industrial Cluster Plan, if you like, is the grand architecture or the glue that brings this together. But as good as the deployment projects in our region are, and East Coast Cluster is fabulous, fabulous, fabulous project, and Humber Zero is a fabulous project, and VNet Zero would be a fabulous project too. As good as those deployment projects are, they will not get Humber industry to net zero. We don't quite know what the size of the gap is, but there will be a gap to get to net zero. So if we're going to get to net zero by 2040, we have to do something else. And we have to work out, first of all, what the size of that gap is likely to be. And then we also have to work out how we're going to deal with that gap. And whether that's about things like natural carbon sequestration, whether it's about optimizing some of the fantastic plans that Zero Carbon Humber have. Can you move the pipeline by 500 meters this way? We can pick up a number 7 emitter or whatever. All those sorts of things. Whether it's about things like direct air capture, whether we can bring that to fruition in the Humber, or even looking after things like salt marshification around the fringes of the Humber estuary. There will be lots of other things that we probably need to look at too. So what are we going to do in order to close the gap to get us to net zero by 2040? And that's where the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan comes in. It also takes account of things like what are the skills that we're going to need to do to deliver all of this stuff. You know, if you look at the fantastic work with the East Coast Cluster, they're looking at something like a peak of about 30,000 jobs to make this happen for the Humber and Teesside. They're also looking at about 4,000 ongoing jobs in terms of operations and maintenance. Those are big, big numbers. Where are those people going to come from? How will people know those jobs are going to exist and what the skills are that they'll require for that? That's what the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan is trying to tackle. How will we get the supply chain in place? Nobody's thinking for one moment that all of the material goods we'll need to deliver this will be produced in the Humber. They won't. Of course they won't. But we should at least have a damn good go at optimizing what we can make in the Humber so we can capitalize on that here. And how do smaller companies get lined up in order to be able to provide the sorts of services and materials and goods and such like that projects like this will need going down the line. So that's where I'll leave you with a notion of what the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan is, and I'll happily hand back to our chair.
Right, so next up is Dan Sadler from Equinor, and we're delighted that Equinor are hosting this roadshow here in the Humber with DGA. So Dan is a chartered engineer with 20 years experience, previously worked with BEIS advising policy teams on the gas and wider energy industry on the proposed and this High4 Heat programme, as well as the H21 Leeds City Gateway study. Joined Equinor in 2019, the low carbon solutions teams, to work on a range of projects here in the Humber.
Okay, thanks,
Welcome,
Louise.
Dan.
And good afternoon, everyone. I went for a more casual Friday look, you'll have noticed, to my colleagues on the panel. I do think it's quite a funny room because there's a massive screen there, so if you can't see what I'm pointing to, just turn around and look that way. So I head up low carbon solutions for Equinor in the UK. And we've got quite a big portfolio, but obviously a real anchor, the real leader in there is this East Coast cluster, and I'll touch on that in a little bit. But for those who maybe don't know who Equinor are or don't fully understand who Equinor are, so we were a traditional oil and gas major, but we are a pretty broad energy company now. So we're the only commercial CCS operator in Europe, operating CCS at Sleipner and Snorvik for 25 years and the best part of 10 years respectively. We're also building Northern Lights over in Norway, which is the world's first CO2 shipping import facility. We own and operate Kjellbergodden, which is, well, it was actually the world's biggest methanol site, I think up to about 5 years ago. 700 megawatt hydrogen production capability at that site with both steam methane reformation and autothermal reformation. And we're also a growing wind major, so we're actually building alongside our partners SSE and E&I Dogger Bank, which is the world's biggest wind farm. We built the world's first floating wind farms off Scotland. We're building the wind farm off New York. So we're pretty well versed, I suppose, in these low carbon solution ambitions. And we're also the lead in Zero Carbon Humber, which is actually the consortium that was the forerunner to this successful East Coast cluster bid. And that's a consortium of 12 different companies across the Humber. And one thing I would say, I mean, picking up on Jonathan's point about the size of the Humber, you know, when you're talking at a national level, it often looks quite big and quite scary. You know, it's a whopper of an area, isn't it? You know, geographically it's huge, massive diversified industries. You know, that you almost can't say the word Humber without massive in the front of it. But the point is, what Humber gives is optionality. It gives optionality to go faster or slower, dependent on your appetite for cost and carbon savings. And it's well joined up. You know, there is a common collaboration around a common need, and that common need is infrastructure. So no project in the regions that can decarbonise from an industrial perspective can do it without infrastructure. And what the East Coast cluster gives us is it gives us that infrastructure, which then unlocks all the projects. So just, I'll explain to people what this East Coast cluster is as well, because there might be different levels of knowledge in the room, but you can see here these are some of the reports from this week, and we should be celebrating, because this award is huge. And I think people probably naively actually thought that everybody was going to get something in this government competition. You know, the government won't really make decisions. Well, they have made decisions, and we've won. And Liverpool's won. And I think it's a shame. I agree with Scotland. I think it'd be great if they can do something. But what we have to remember is this all costs money, and there's an affordability envelope, which is why the government has to select. And it's selected the East Coast cluster because it's a value proposition like no other. It will create an international lighthouse for this region. And I already work with our colleagues over in America where we're doing teachings about the Humber industrial cluster. You know, what an incredible position to be in. We're advising industrial regions in the States about best practice from the Humber. So look at the headlines, you know, forerunners in carbon capture deployment, 41,000 jobs by 2026 across the region actually. Now what it is all these industrial clusters need infrastructure. They need carbon capture and storage, and that's to both deploy hydrogen at scale, as in blue hydrogen, but also to do post-combustion capture across many of these industries, whether it be steel, refineries, chemicals, you know, whichever one it is, those who can't fuel switch. So each of the industrial clusters put a bid in the cluster sequencing process to say we should be the first to deploy. So remember the 10-point plan says that we will have 4 industrial clusters CCS enabled by 2030, but the first 2 by the mid-20s. So the cluster sequencing process wasn't about saying we're not interested in Scotland or Wales or Humber or Liverpool. It was saying we can't afford everything at once. So we need to pick the first two. And the first two that they've now picked are this East Coast cluster, which is actually joining two industrial regions, Humber and Teesside, a huge value proposition for government, and Liverpool. And Scotland have been put in reserve, which means that if for some reason we're not delivering on what we said, they can come forward, which is, I think, unlikely in this region. But actually, they could be looking at negotiation for business models towards the latter stage of the decade. So it's a big prize that we've won here, because if we hadn't won it, all these project ambitions that you hear about are all pushed back in time because they can't connect to the infrastructure. So what is it? You can see here, I'll look at the back if you can't see here, but so this is Teesside and Humber. Obviously everybody will know this well. Net Zero Teesside, which is also an Equinor project. It's a post-combustion power station, but it also has a CCS gathering system. A bit longer than people think, actually. They think it's really small, but it's the best part of 20, 25 kilometres still. To decarbonise the Teesside region. Then the Zero Carbon Humber, which is the onshore infrastructure and projects in the Humber region. And combined, those two industrial clusters account for 50% of UK industrial emissions. Huge, huge tangible impact to UK climate change obligations. But the scale comes from Humber. Make no doubt about that. And to put it into perspective, the Salt and Chemicals Park, and my colleague Tongi will talk about that in a minute, the emissions from the chemicals park alone are equivalent to the emissions of all of Teesside put together. So that just gives you a sense of scale from the Humber. Common infrastructure links across the Humber region. We've got lots of partners across there and lots of projects that are likely to bid into this next phase of the cluster sequencing competition that I'll come on to. But the key thing is both these regions are now linked by common infrastructure. So that's a pipeline system that goes to a store, which is the Endurance store, where Equinor, BP and National Grid own the licence for CO2. And that will be the first store that we deploy for CCS in the UK. And to put into perspective how good that store is, one of our lead geologists I was talking to about Endurance a few years ago, and he said in his professional opinion, the Endurance store is the best geological CO2 store he has ever seen anywhere in the world in his career. We are incredibly lucky that we have this type of geology off our coastline, and that is a big advantage. And then we actually have an expansion strategy, because Endurance isn't big enough on its own for all these emissions. And the expansion strategy is also partners with Equinor and BP for further stores, so that we can pick up this growing necessity to capture more and more emissions. In terms of jobs and economic benefit, as part of the cluster sequencing process, we had to forecast what that benefit was. And remember, these are multi-billion pound projects. These aren't million-pound projects. They're multi-billion pound projects. And by the way, Equinor as a company have actually got a corporate target to get to net zero as well. And by 2030, we've committed in the markets that we'll be investing over 50% of our gross capex on low-carbon solutions and renewable projects, which is a multi-billion pound commitment. So what does this look like? Well, actually, if we do everything we're talking about, if we deliver the East Coast cluster infrastructure and then connect the projects to it, we're talking about 25,000 jobs on average up to 2050. They're sustained jobs. Some of those are safeguarded jobs, so protecting jobs that are already in our region, and a lot of those are new jobs. That would peak in 2026 at around 41,000 jobs. That's subject to how many projects the government supports as well, but 41,000 at peak, because that's the peak of construction. You can see how the jobs split between direct and indirect jobs. So direct jobs working directly on the projects, indirect jobs working across the supply chain. In construction, it's split 50-50, but in operations, obviously the direct jobs drop, but actually the supply chain jobs maintain. So that's that sustaining jobs piece over the years. Remember that 25,000 doesn't include induced jobs. Those are jobs in the surrounding area, the hospitality sector, car sales, anything you can think of. And typically, as a rule of thumb, you double the direct and indirect jobs. So you're talking about, from delivering this East Coast cluster, around 50,000 jobs on average from now to 2050. A huge prize for the region. And what does that translate to in terms of economic benefit to UK PLC? Well, that's an average of 2 billion per year of economic benefit to UK PLC. So a huge, huge contributor. But the thing to remember is those jobs, remember the target is net zero in 2050, not net zero Humber or net zero Teesside, it's net zero UK. So this first phase of the East Coast cluster, you can see on that kind of blue line there. So there's the 25, well, the average is 25,000 jobs. There's the peak at 41,000 in 2026. But that would capture around 20 million tonnes per annum by 2030. And that's nowhere near enough. The UK still emits over 400 million tonnes per annum, to put it into perspective. So what you would then do is a second wave of investment as you grow more capability, produce more hydrogen, both blue and green, capture more carbon from these critical industries, indeed drive inwards investment into the region as international companies look to leverage the advantage of low carbon systems to produce their own green products to trade into the global market. And what happens after that wave of investment? There's another wave of investment, and another wave, and another wave, because you have to get to net zero. So if you look at the Committee on Climate Change's advice and the 10-point plan, 2030 is somewhere between 10 in the 10-point plan or 22 million tonnes per annum CCS, 5 gigawatts of hydrogen. 2035 is 53 million tonnes per annum CCS, and around, well, 15 to 20 installed capacity gigawatts of hydrogen. 2050 is 100 million tonnes per annum of CCS, and between 225 and 375 terawatt hours of hydrogen going to all sorts of different sectors, from maritime to steel to industry to chemicals to potentially heat to transport. So you can see this is a rolling programme unlocked by this first piece of infrastructure. And if you just carry on the trajectory, you could be talking 50 to 100,000 jobs as we progress towards 2050. So the last thing I'll say before handing over to Tongi is, you know, we all know the Humber relatively well, I think, but this is a new graphic that we've just developed for Zero Carbon Humber. Easington, really important terminal. I mean, we've mentioned how much gas comes in there, and a lot of that's actually our gas at the Langlead terminal. Some of the lowest footprint gas in the world. The Saltend Chemicals Park, over 100 years old. You know, emissions equivalent to all of Teesside, producing 2 million tonnes of chemicals every year, critical for the international market. Come across to the South Bank and you've got the refineries. That's one third of all UK refinery capacity there. And then you come inland further still to British Steel, one of only 2 remaining primary production steelworks in the UK. Keadby and Equinor have also got projects at Keadby. There's Keadby 3, which is a post-combustion power station. And there's also Keadby Hydrogen, which is looking to be the world's first 100% hydrogen power station. And then at the end, we've got Drax. And Drax, we need to remember, is Europe's biggest biomass power station. 16 million tonnes of bio-CO2 every year. So as Jonathan said, you need 3 things to decarbonise an industrial cluster. You need carbon capture and storage. You need hydrogen for those fuel switch industries that can fuel switch, and you need an element of BECCS to offset those very difficult to get emissions. And Drax gives us huge potential for both biofuels and BECCS as we carry on. So the perfect kind of storm of scale, industry, ambition, and established businesses who've got both the financial capacity and the experience and credibility to pull this off. And where we are now, just for those who aren't aware, is that now we've been successful in the cluster sequencing phase 1 competition, which means we're now into negotiations about building the infrastructure. Phase 2 kicks off for those clusters that were successful in phase 1, so only now Humber, Teesside and Liverpool. And what happens is the projects who want to connect to that CO2 T&S infrastructure will formally bid into the process with government, and then the projects will be selected by government similar to the infrastructure. So it's all to play for, but we have some fantastic projects in the Humber with Equinor, obviously H2H Saltend and our Keadby 3 projects and our wider H2H ambitions, but as well with some of the other industries across the region. So with that, I'll pass back to Louise, and then Louise can introduce Tongi, as I think is normal.
Thank you, Dan.
Case. Cheers.
So, Tongi Cosmo, you're next. So he's the H2H Saltend project director. He has worked for Equinor since 2006, leading on business and project developments in several countries, including Azerbaijan, North Africa, and Brazil, and studied civil engineering in France and the USA.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I put no tie. I thought that was a casual Friday in UK, but obviously I failed. Next time I know what casual Friday means. Before to give you, I've got 2 slides. Before I give you a bit of update on H2H Saltend, I would like to take you to what we call the Hydrogen-to-Humber roadmap. In October 2020, when our new CEO, Anders Sobedal, took charge of the company, he made an announcement that I think took a few months for the employees of Equinor to understand. In 2050, Equinor will be a net zero emission company. Not just the CO2 emission from our platform, but also the CO2 emission from our own product. And these are tens of millions of CO2 emitted from our gas and oil burned around the world. This was pretty significant, and we were probably the first oil and gas company announcing that. And blue hydrogen is one of the solutions that we see to decarbonize our own product. I spent 30 years of my life developing oil and gas field, and I took charge of this project about a year ago, and I'm reskilling every day on this user journey, as the company is doing. We are doing an energy transition, which is it's a new birth for the company, and I'm very proud that the first really project that we see that is going to go ahead is this deployment at scale of hydrogen across the Humber region. It will start with H2H Saltend, which I will give you a few data in the next slide, but it's one project. We see a hydrogen program development across the Humber for us. First in Saltend, the Saltend Chemical Park. I see some operator in the park, SOPX in the room. Just the Saltend Chemical Park emit more than 3 million tons of CO2 per year. We are moving into this park to help and assist our off-takers to decarbonize this. And the first project, Saltend, H2H Saltend, will tackle about 1 million tons of CO2. We hope part of this program is to develop an ammonia plant, a first blue ammonia plant, which will target some export projects to fuel. We believe that maritime fuel will go into blue ammonia as an alternative to decarbonize this sector. The second project, coming very quickly after the first one by 2028, is to move in the Lincolnshire area, and on the back of this 100% hydrogen fuel power plant developed jointly between SSE and Equinor. And this is potentially another hydrogen production plant of 1.2 to 1.5. So collectively, we're talking by 2030, a potential production of hydrogen in this region of 1.8 gigawatt of hydrogen production. And you compare that to the 5 gigawatt that Dan mentioned earlier at UK level. So it's significant, a portion of the UK ambition. Collectively, it will be around 3 million tons of CO2 that will be captured by this plant. Beyond that, it's the blending of hydrogen into the heat for fuel, but this is probably beyond 2030, 2035. But very short term, the next 5-6 years, we're talking about 1.8 gigawatts of production across the Humber. A few words about H2H Saltend. A lot of the people I've met have worked on Saltend Chemical Park at some point in time in their career. It's a place that I've visited now a few times. Our CEO actually was on site on Thursday with us, looking at the site, understanding the complexity, but also the opportunity to develop a hydrogen plant on site. I want to highlight, we finished our feasibility study back in June using Worley, and now we move into the next stage of the project definitions. We have hired, I would say, the 3 best EPC contractor that you can find in this hydrogen ammonia, and you've seen them, and some of them came to support their client today, so I thank them. And collectively, these three consortium have built 60–70% of the hydrogen installed capacity around the world and ammonia installed capacity in the world. Because hydrogen and ammonia is not a new technology. It has a 60 years experience, 60 years industry experience, good and bad, and it's an industry that has improved over the years. We also are starting our permitting and consent engagement. ERM, again in the room today, if you want to talk to them, are assisting us in preparing our application of the permitting. It's an important step. We're going to start to engage through the council with some statutory authority, but also engaging with the local population and being engaged in an open way about any concern around the deployment of such project. We also have a very important interface is with the ECC or NGV and BP NEP TNS system, the transport and storage system, because our 3 million tons of CO2 we wish to capture in the next 5 to 6 years will compete with other CO2 capture project across the Humber. So we need to demonstrate to the government through this phase 2 sequencing, which is a new race to access this system for us, that we have the most competitive and the best for your pounds when it comes to the CO2 capture cost. So it's a very exciting moment. We have engaged the best service company, the best EPC contractor to assist us. Project is progressing very well, and we're looking forward to potentially in January, February, or March to announce, or the government announcing that H2H Saltend is the first hydrogen project to be deployed in UK. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now we've heard from all of our speakers, and we're going to come to a time of question. And I guess I get the privilege because I'm here. When will we actually see things happening at Saltend, I suppose, and round in this region? Because there's a lot of work to do before then, of course. So when will we actually see it happening?
Well, I think the target is that we're able to take a FID on the infrastructure by late 2023, and the aim is to be commissioned, so actually flowing CO2 by late 2026.
So not long.
Yeah, so not long. So you'll see that we're actually out to consultation on the pipelines at the moment, which is led by National Grid, supported by Equinor. So really things are actually happening. These projects are in development, but like I said, the target date is that the negotiations with government are key because they unlock the business models, take the FID, and then build and execute with commissioning date 2026. And that follows very similar to the H2H Saltend commissioning timeline.
Gosh, okay. So are there any questions in the room for our panel here? I'd like to just say that we're very delighted to see Lord Prescott with us this afternoon. It's very topical at the moment with the BBC documentary. I've been seeing quite a lot of you. Sorry, I saw it.
It was actually just following on from your question, I suppose, who are the sort of partners that you're working with in the area? Because that's quite a short timeline, purely from a skills point of view, with other infrastructure projects that are going on across the UK as well. So how are you building that pipeline here, and how will it tie in with things that we're hearing around, for example, the levelling up agenda, and making sure that there is a really strong sort of community building and sort of, I suppose, sort of productivity raising exercise that goes on as well in the region?
Do you want to touch on the supply, David?
Yes, I think it's clearly understood. I mean, this is not just about CO2 capture, it's also about leveling up and meeting this agenda. With our contractors, we will reach out to the suppliers across the region in an event we're organizing end of November. 2 years before starting construction, we're already outreaching here the community and the network of companies. And I think Catch is here today, and they will assist us and open the doors to connect the dot between our main contractors, our tier 1 contractors, with the tier 2, 3, and 4. 2 years before we even start, the first pouring of concrete or running piles. So really a work up front. The skill needed to develop a hydrogen plant, it's a chemical plant. So this region has 106 years of experience with chemical, so it's not new skills. There's lack of these skills probably, but in terms of the type of skill, it's been there. And And Catch is having 150 vocational training on a yearly basis the last 20 years. So it is in the planning process. Thank you.
I think just to add on to that a couple of points is, obviously that's H2H Saltend specific, but remember this ambition to get to net zero. So, and I chair the Sector Development Working Group for the Government's Hydrogen Advisory Council. And this is one of the topics that we're specifically looking at is, how do you ensure local content, both in terms of the supply chain, but also the workforce that's delivering it? And there's a bit of a gap. You know, what we have to be able to do is not artificially stall the first projects, because we have to make sure we use the supply chains that are established. But it's super important that we can join the dots of government ambition together with very clear educational programmes, apprenticeship schemes, so that we can really learn from the best in terms of delivering, but then we can kind of transition where it's that domestic, homegrown workforce over time.
Just to add to that, I mean, the important thing behind your question, or one of the elements that was important behind your question, is this is not activity that we're doing instead of other activity in the UK. This is activity we're doing as well as. And so getting the skills pipeline right is really, really important, and engaging right at the early stages with, you know, the schools and colleges around the region that are seeking to understand how do they get the language right around when those skills are going to be needed. And it's not, we're generally not looking at new skills here. We're actually looking at skills, many of the same skills, but set in a different context. And it's a new renewable energy decarbonisation context. And just getting that conversation going right is, as early as possible, is really helpful.
Sorry about that.
Just on that, on the supply chain, this Net Zero Centre here is all about SMEs and talking about making sure that there's equitable distribution of economic benefit in the region. And we know, we've just done a big study on the region's SMEs and their journey to net zero. And most of the SMEs in this region, over 80%, are 10 people and less. Now, many of those are very innovative, and this place is here to help them. How are you going to help those companies that are probably tier 4, 5, 6, and don't always get the attention? The attention's often just on the 2, 3 top tiers. And for this region, that's really important. That's where a lot of the skills are. How it's not really been done, I don't think, well in the past in this country.
No, it's not. And what I don't think we want to do is kind of, you know, offshore or wind, rather, in the UK has been a phenomenal success. But actually, we're really only involved in the end stage assembly as opposed to manufacture. And what they're doing now is they're embedding kind of obligations for local content in wind projects going forward. Now, we're at the start of nascent markets here. CCS markets, hydrogen markets, they are new markets. So in the Sector Development Working Group, it's a specific topic we're wrestling with, is saying, well, how do you ensure that you don't delay the projects whilst allowing these SMEs access and understanding? And in the Zero Carbon Humber Consortium, we actually have the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre as a key partner. And what they're doing is they're working across all the big projects, and we're trying to give them access to the level 1 and 2 contractors, so that we can then look back into the UK supply chain and identify companies that maybe could tender for certain elements straight away, companies that maybe can't yet, but could with a little bit of guidance, and then other areas where we may want to develop, but it would need some sort of government intervention. So those schemes we're just trying to establish at the moment. We're doing supplier days. Actually, I know H2H Saltend have got supplier days coming up. But it's something that we want to work with the local communities, the local authorities, and via the AMRC at that local and national level to really try and coordinate. But the key point is that we don't want to stall the projects. So we have to get these projects going to establish the infrastructure. You know, we don't want to drop behind, and before you know it, it goes back up to Scotland. But we want to make sure that those SMEs are positioned in the right way.
So, just to add to that, I think it's really important that events such as this to help get that message out there about the opportunity that's on the horizon, and get people engaged locally and recognise and realise the potential is extremely important.
And maybe think laterally that they may not have traditionally been involved, but that there are opportunities. Chris, given that you've so you've been on a long roadshow, as you were sharing with us, and visited quite a lot of carbon capture projects over the years. What common challenges would you say they have?
Okay, so I think technical challenges, there aren't many technical barriers. Most of the technology that's going to be deployed is already deployed, is mature technologies. The small gaps there are in the technical evidence base are being addressed as we speak. So I don't think technically there are any particular barriers. For me, just my own personal opinion, the key barriers are the commercial frameworks to entice investment to move the agenda forward, being the primary barrier at the moment. And secondly, maybe slightly more controversially, I think some of the planning processes that we have to go through to get a project over the line are maybe overburden projects and could be streamlined to help improve the timelines.
Okay, thank you. Any more questions from the room or any online? Oh, David.
Obviously what we're seeing here is like a living lab of innovation that for us would be great to export around the world. The Asturian model that we're trying to develop here is to ensure that we can export this expertise around the world. So we touched on obviously what we've been doing with things like offshore maintenance and setting up wind farms around the world. We're getting people from Grimsby and Hull going to New England to set up offshore wind farms there. So it's a very exciting time. What would you be able to do to help us develop this model here, especially when you look at the enormous export potential that 60% of the world's population live by an estuary line, and I think it's something like 20 out of 32 of the largest cities. How engaged would you be able to basically develop obviously what we're doing here and then export that, but obviously promoting our expertise that we will have learned on the Humber then around the world?
I'd be happy to have a crack at answering that, and thank you for the question. And you're right, I was sort of fortunate when I took up this role, actually, that about a week before I joined, the World Economic Forum posted an article suggesting that there were two really important industrial clusters in the world. There was one in China, and there was the Humber. And I was able to use that when I took up my job, which was fantastic timing. So the eyes of the world are upon us in terms of what the art of the possible could be here. So the analogy with the connections around the living lab space, I think, is absolutely appropriate. And already I've had conversations with clusters of industry in Germany, in Holland, in Houston, in California, who are all asking, what is it you're doing in the Humber? How are you bringing together companies and clusters who are actually at some levels competing and at other levels collaborating? How does that work? How have you got this public-private partnership here that's sort of looking to address these huge industrial emissions in the Humber? And so the fantastic kind of attention and opportunity we've got here to shine a light on the Humber for these exceptional reasons of what we're seeking to deliver in the Humber and the collaborative partnership way in which we're doing it. But also there's another side to that. And there's a side which is, you know, I sort of missed the opportunity to reference the inward economic investment element of the Humber Cluster Plan, but there's something in here about saying to industries around the world and elsewhere in the UK, if you're concerned about net zero and how you get your business to net zero, come and look at it in the Humber. Come and look at your industry here. We've got an evidence base that tells you about the land we've got, the support we've got, the access to CO2 transport and storage, the access to hydrogen that's provided, the access to low carbon electricity. We can back that up with the whole skills piece that shows you what the skills portfolio looks like in the region, the supply chain. It's taken care of. You don't need to worry about it. Just come and look at it in the Humber. And that's the sort of conversation we want to be having in the future, as well as the flip side of that, taking our expertise and being able to take it elsewhere in the world and help others to decarbonise, not just because it's for the benefit of the world, but also because it's an opportunity, an economic opportunity in a sense.
So I agree with all of that, but I think there's one key thing is delivery. You have to deliver. So the outcome, so the wind example is a perfect example because the Humber's delivered. Yeah. So delivery is key. You know, we've already, like I said, we're doing teachings across to America. I've got a meeting with the Department of Energy on Monday where we're going to talk all through how to pull a consortium together, how to engage with government, how to pivot your schemes to make sure you can make them affordable. You know, all this type of stuff. But the key is delivery. And that's why that decision this week that the East Coast cluster is track 1 is so important, because the first movers always get the best advantage. So delivery is absolutely key, working across the communities, working in areas like this. We've got lots of people, or growing amounts of people from the region as well. Yeah, obviously I'm from this region. So I think delivery is key. If we deliver and continue to deliver and continue to collaborate, then effectively a lot of the rest of it kind of sorts itself out.
Any more questions? Are there... Steve?
Yeah, it's Steve Ross from Costain. These are great projects. We're involved heavily with HyNet and also with SWIC down in South Wales from that point of view. But the question that keeps coming up when I talk to the Shells and the Dragons of this world is all about the infrastructure, the piping. So if we take Scunthorpe at one end, Immingham at the other, there needs to be a big plan somewhere that just says, where's that going to fit, and who's going to pick up the bill for that core infrastructure program that really makes these things start to work more effectively. So at what point do you start to bring the grid in and the gas operators in relation to this discussion?
Well, what you have to remember is that on the CO2 transport and storage system, which is the main bit you're alluding to there, in Humber it's a parallel pipeline system. It's a CO2 TNS system with a parallel hydrogen transmission system. And the reason the parallel is because it saves you about 150 million in terms of construction costs to put them in together. And if you look at the government ambitions, why would you put one in after the other? You know, it's like the Carlsberg advert, isn't it? Let's put them in together. And let's see if we do that. But I think the key point is that the CO2 TNS system is going to be a regulated monopoly system, is the position. So that the system is being designed to link all the industrial regions of the Humber, from Drax to Keedby, to British Steel, across to Immingham, across the Saltend, down to Easington and off to the coast, to the stores. So that's already in play. The regulatory asset-based system is the commercial framework which will make it investable. It will need some support from government subsidy, but that support can drop quicker in Humber than anywhere else because of the scale. But then it depends on how the phase 2 process, how quickly does the government want to support projects who can connect to that system, for how you then effectively utilise that right size system to offload the subsidy. So I think the business model frameworks are there. The system is being developed to link all the industrial region. We need to go through the final consultation, but remember now we're in a negotiation with government for how that regulatory business model works. And then it'll just be a case of projects connecting using a normal tariff system, just like you would on the national transmission system. But obviously this way you're going into it as opposed to coming out of it.
And there's also a dimension to that, which is getting the transport and storage system right in the Humber is phenomenally important, as Dan's just outlined. But that's to deal with primarily the Humber estuaries industrial emissions. There's also a question that we're looking to address in the Humber Industrial Cluster Plan, which is all about to what extent can the Humber estuary actually perform a function for other parts of the UK. So not all of the parts of the UK where they have industrial clusters are fortunate enough to have a fantastic reservoir like we have offshore here from the Humber, so we will have to form a sort of support system, as it were, to be able to kind of deal with things like either import of CO2 or perhaps even connecting pipelines which go off beyond Zero Carbon Humber's current plans and take in West Yorkshire or South Yorkshire or other parts of the UK. And so you're right, absolutely right. Getting that approach to the infrastructure behind this is phenomenally important.
And if you look at the right back to the days of the H21 scheme, you know, that was a hydrogen transmission system from Easington right across to the West Yorkshire conurbation, where you could start to convert gas networks, provide hydrogen for transport, for heat. But those policy decisions aren't made yet. So the aim is to start the infrastructure off in the industrial cluster, make sure you lock in the business models, make sure you drive down the costs, you grow public familiarity and then acceptability, and then you can expand that infrastructure out beyond the industrial cluster alongside policy.
Final point, if I may. Sorry, this is sounding a bit like the Dan and Jonathan show. I do apologise. But you mentioned National Grid. National Grid and some of their domestic gas supply partners are already looking at how they can reuse and optimise parts of the existing gas infrastructure. So new pipelines are fantastic, of course they are, and we need those. But there's also something about making sure we reuse the existing infrastructure in the smartest possible way. So don't forget about all the billions that have been spent on that and the embedded carbon in it too.
Can I just pick up a final one on that, Louise, and break the Jonathan and Dan show? So, yeah, just picking up on the existing gas infrastructure and the existing gas networks. You know, the gas network in the UK has a regulatory asset-based value of something in the region of 25 billion. You know, it really is a national gem that we should find a way to reutilise. But it's not so much the infrastructure. The more important thing to me is maintaining optionality for consumers, for customers. And I think that's something we're in danger of forgetting when we, you know, there's no silver bullet. Everyone accepts it's going to be a mix of hydrogen, other decarbonised gases and electrification. But what we're missing to some degree at the moment is just allowing that basis to maintain consumer optionality and let customers choose what energy, what decarbonised source of energy they want to use in the future.
Right. Any more questions from the room? And were there any online? No online questions. Any more questions from the room? Because we plan to sort of finish about now. So if there are no... Oh, one more.
One very quick question. So my name is Paul Wong from a company called Emerson. I have about 100 questions, but I'll try and settle on one. Maybe.
So the transport and storage system has a certain capacity, the store has a certain capacity, and it will be an open competition. So there's probably more carbon capture that the system can handle. So so there is eventually a capacity constraint. I mean, if you make the sum of the Humber and the Teesside, you're well above the 35 million tons, which will be some of the limitations there. So it's very important to, as a capture project, to be in first. Otherwise, you will have to wait the expansion of this store or other store to be developed, as mentioned by Jonathan. So it's a capacity constraint towards the system, and so the best will win. The best project will win. The best project for UK. What is the best value for money in that? So it's for us as a first project. It's a capacity constraint that we want to enter the system as a first project.
Would any of you like to sort of give some last words that you'd like to leave the room with before we close?
Yeah, okay. So I think one of the things that has been touched upon already, which is the technology dimension, and I think it's important not to be overly fazed by the technology we're talking about here. This is, in general terms, reasonably well-known technology. It's been reasonably well delivered and operated in various parts of the world. Sometimes what we're talking about is coupling new technologies together. That might be a little bit different. Sometimes it's about doing the technology at a slightly different scale to that which it's been done at before. That might be a little bit different. But generally, the technology is known, it's quantifiable, and it doesn't change. The really important part of making this work are what I call the 3 Ps. It's getting the people on board, it's about getting the right sort of policies in place, and it's about the profitability. In other words, getting the right sort of business models to make this work. The technology is not the difficult bit.
Yes, I think by now you understand that it's going to be a competition for a capture project, and there's a commitment to develop hydrogen across the Humber, but we need to be the first project to enter the system, and this requires support from councils, industry, service provider to make this proposal compelling. Again, we're decarbonizing on behalf of some of the other emitters, because this hydrogen will help various multi-clients to decarbonize their own industry. So we need the support, the collective support of the Humber regions, as much as the region has supported Zero Carbon Humber to win the right to have this major infrastructure to be developed. Now the Humber region needs to help an hydrogen producer to win the right to enter this system.
Thanks, Tony. I think just a couple of words to maybe add is first of all, we should be incredibly proud of the region. And what I find when I travel around is the Humber's often quite quiet. And it is quiet partly because of its size, partly because of, you know, let's say exciting competition between the North and South Banks that we all can kind of, as locals, laugh about. But if you look over in kind of Liverpool and Manchester, they're quite well coordinated using the Manchester Mayor, the Liverpool Mayor. So I think that getting that collective voice, leveraging that political weight of the Sheffield City region, the Leeds City region, because realistically this is the anchor for all their ambitions as well. So I think that the Humber, one, we should be incredibly proud. We've got an incredible value proposition here. Collaboration's key, but I think advocacy, you know, many-to-many conversations, really raising awareness of this, and like Tongi said, I think making sure that at a national level, people know that there is support for this hydrogen ambition, for these hydrogen projects, and for these CCS schemes. That's critically important.
Before I come to you, and I was going to ask you one last question.
Thank you.
Before I come to Chris, did you have one question, Lord Prescott?
Blimey, that sense of being lost from you, there's no doubt about that. First to say, when I watch what they bring up from the Roadshow bottom now, that was bidged here nearly over 7 months long. I've always been a while about that time as well. Shout a bit more, but it's always a bit more difficult than it was before. But what I learned, a number of things. One, but I'd always escaped to the Trumbo over, must have been nearly 7 or 8 hours of being involved in. Now when I turn it and open it, and I look back, talk about it as being shot, if I look what the Humber has said in the last 6 years, you can only take a year if you wanted, but it's given you time to open up, look at bigger ground. It's a wonderful bay, the Humber. That's why we feel so wonderful. You are here to represent how people are really answered. When I was a bit slower on the side, and then if we talked about more than the Humber, the Humber's everything. I used to argue, talk to the Humber side, talk to them as one area for the estuary. No, they stood in the area, but it's different. You've picked all the pictures now. I'm delighted to see, as a younger man, to see what has changed, and hopefully you join up a lot of things, but to say it's absolute wonder. It's the time for the estuary. The Humber Bridge, they came 20 years ago, nobody wanted to do it. Now they build the bit, now they build the medic. Hull talks to Grimsby. It now goes further than that if you look at it. So what is happening is a major trap will take in here. We talk about the Humber side. We're going, I'll tell you where the estuary is going to be. It's going to be in the Cooster and in Merseyside. That's where the big estuary came. That's where all the big came from. Now we're the underweighted part of an estuary to make its facility develop. And now when I see the maps is even guiding up, seeing the extra places go. Mind, still you're just losing that little bit across the bridge. I think you got third in that. If we look, not only that we're stopping at home, we go north and look at the ports that have been developed. Look at all boilers gone there. See how others have gone. Now we go even further forward. We have a trade time. I'm not going to take it. I'm shooting away and I'm picking the mic. I'm talking too fast and my father keeps telling me. But basically, can I say thank you very much for the opportunity to say that. But for me to be at one night, to be your audience, all the enthusiasm that's coming, to be there, to see the change. So I'm happy to catch up now. Thought I had gauged before. Not now. Got to cut a bit. I'll be back. Keep my mouth shut. But I'm here to play my part. But thank you so much to come to this school, see the opening of the bolt of their water. So what enthusiasm. It was wonderful. Take some time. Do what I can. I keep on now telling me I'm speaking too often. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, I think it must be a really gratifying to you at, you know, Kyoto 30 years ago now. And finally, we're getting there. So thank you very much, Lord Prescott. So one final anecdote. So Chris here has been doing the roadshow in a hydrogen-powered car. How easy was that challenge for you?
I'll try and keep my language suitable for the room. It's ridiculous. So I get back to consumer and customer optionality. So we've a massive challenge to decarbonise transport, and things are starting to move. You know, I think 40% of all car sales now are electric vehicles. there are two types of electric vehicles. There are battery electric vehicles, there are fuel cell electric vehicles. The key difference between the two is battery electric vehicles, you plug in, you charge up overnight. A fuel cell electric vehicle has an onboard supply of hydrogen. Through a fuel cell produces the power to power the car. And it's very similar in operation to the way the pattern of current car ownership, where you go to a fueling station, you fuel up, a couple of minutes fueling up with hydrogen, and you're away. 330 miles, I think, the range of the vehicle I've got. However, there are 11 hydrogen fueling stations in the UK. At the moment, the ITM fueling station in Sheffield is out of action until the 27th, so there is no hydrogen fueling facilities for the public between Birmingham and Aberdeen. Now, to get... I travelled from the northwest yesterday I travelled from the northwest across to Hull yesterday evening. I had to set off at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, got here at 11:30 at night after driving to Birmingham to fill up with hydrogen to travel up here. So, you know, serious point. I'm having a bit of a whine and a moan, but I feel entitled to. But you know, there is a serious point here, which is consumer optionality. Unless we can provide a network of hydrogen fueling stations, who's going to buy a hydrogen car?
Quite. Well, I think that brings it to, and there's a little bit of time for networking, and I think teas and coffees are still on the mezzanine. So Jonathan, Tanguy, Dan, Chris, thank you very, very much for coming here and giving an overview of what you're about to do. I mean, we're good at this stuff in Britain, and you know, being the region that led on the last industrial revolution, it's only right that we should be leading on the green industrial revolution. So thank you all very much for coming here. Thank you very much to our speakers.
Thank you.